we grew 2.8% last year, and now we're headed for like 1.2% or so, which is really a pretty dramatic slowdown. It doesn't happen that often that you make policy decisions that are so detrimental to prosperity that you manage to cut economic growth by more than half. It really just is Trump thinking that trade is bad. There's no sense in which we're trying to move production toward friendlier countries. This year, we may even see, negative migration, which really would be something that hasn't happened for about 50 years or so.
Hello and welcome to this IEA podcast. My name is Reem, Ibrahim, and I'm the Head of Media and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am delighted to be joined by Stan Veuger. Stan is a Senior Fellow in Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and has written some really interesting research over the last few months on all things Trump, tariffs, and immigration. Stan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi, Reem. Thank you for having me on. How you doing?
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about what has happened so far under the Trump administration. Of course, we've seen huge numbers of tariffs, huge swathes of tariffs and restrictions on trade. What has happened? Where have the pauses occurred? And what do you think are the sort of macroeconomic effects of all of this?
That's a great question. A lot of things have happened, and really starting on day one of the Trump administration. So when Trump came into office, I think certainly in financial markets, there was this expectation that on trade policy, things were maybe going to look a bit the way they did during Trump's first term, which was, very aggressive toward China and with a lot of language that was, a little more negative on trade agreements than we'd gotten used to. But, other than with China and some, industry-specific issues, broadly speaking, we would remain in the sort of world we're used to. That has definitely not been the case. So on day one, Trump announced new 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which are two of our closest trading partners. In theory, we have a free trade agreement with them that Trump himself negotiated and signed during his first term, but that went out in the window. Then, there were a number of smaller moves between then and early April. For example, we imposed for a few hours pretty significant tariffs on other sanctions on Colombia because they wouldn't accept military planes with deportees on them for a few hours. We made some moves in various specific industries. But then in early April is really when the big shock came, especially to people, I think, outside the US. I think here attitudes had already shifted a bit because of what Trump did with Canada and Mexico. I think in Europe or the UK, in Japan and South Korea, other major trading partners, really the shock came in early April on what the administration misleadingly refers to as Liberation Day, when they announced new tariffs on basically every country in the world. In some cases, very high tariffs, all the way up to almost 50%, and a minimum tariff of 10% on every. And those tariffs were calculated really explicitly as depending on how large the bilateral trade deficit in goods was with each country, right? So no geopolitics, no national security considerations, just, straight up mercantilism. Imports are bad, exports are good. The larger the bilateral trade deficit in goods is with the country, the higher our tariffs are going to. That led to really kind of a panic in financial markets, who, as I said, I think underestimated how Trump was going to behave in this term. Major sell-off in the stock market, which here in the U.S., as you know, is very salient to voters as well as people who work in financial markets, because so many people have their pension savings in the stock market, and so they'll see on their phone, oh, I lost like $60K today because of the president's tariffs, and some people don't tend to like that. Bond markets were a little bit disturbed as well, and so a week after the announcement, then less than a day after the tariffs kicked in, they suspended them all the way until last week when they came back into force. Sort of on a separate track, there was a brief escalation with China, where for a moment we had tariffs that were well over 100%. Those have been brought down, and we're now in this weird extended truce with China, where we have tariffs in place that are higher than they were when Trump came into office, around 50%, but not as high as they were then. And now every 90 days, apparently that status quo gets extended as we continue to negotiate. China has, quite effectively retaliated against Trump. I think that's part of why he backed down a bit. And so that's where things stand now. The macroeconomic consequences, I think, have been quite negative. Last year, US GDP grew by about 2.8%. This year, first half of the year, we're on track to grow by about 1.2%. Right? So far this year, we've grown 0.6%, which is really a dramatic deceleration. Some of that is because of immigration policy, as we'll discuss. But I think really the major factor has been the uncertainty around trade policy, the substantive changes in trade policy, just the large tax increase that trade policy constitutes. And so, I think that impact has been quite negative. There's been, as we saw from the PPI numbers that got released this morning, there's been some upward pressure on inflation too. And so it's difficult for the monetary authority to offset the growth slowdown. So that's, I think, the broad picture so far. Sorry for going on for a while, but every single day something happens in this area now. And so it's difficult to summarize a month, let alone almost 7 months.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, because there's so much that's happened, and it does seem as though it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what is influencing Trump's thinking around all of this. I mean, tariffs and, mercantilist restrictions weren't necessarily referenced at all during the electoral campaign last year. So it's sort of, at least to the rest of the world, at least to me, it came as quite a surprise. I wonder if you could talk a bit about why you think this was all happening. Is this like straight level mercantilism, this kind of misunderstanding that imports are bad and that we have this huge trade deficit and therefore we must export? Is it the influence of people like Peter Navarro, who interestingly wasn't there when Trump announced the free trade agreement with the UK? So do you think it's individual people like Peter Navarro, or do you think it is a bit of both? Is it like a genuine misunderstanding of trade policy? Or is it, as some people are saying, all of just a negotiating tactic that is being used by Trump to get the rest of the world to bend to their knees?
I think it really is a deeply ingrained misunderstanding of trade policy that Trump has carried with him for decades now. It's one of it may be the single policy area in which he's been most consistent. And I mean, he's always been very negative about the North America Free Trade Agreement, which the predecessor of Free Trade Agreement here. He, I think, is really in some ways a sort of child of the 1980s trade panic around Japan, which in some ways I think was quite similar to what we're seeing today with China. And so I think at that moment he decided, okay, trade is bad. As you put it, imports are bad, exports are good. And I think that's just stuck with him. I do not think it comes from someone like Peter Navarro. In fact, the lore is that during his first term, Trump had decided that he was going to impose tariffs on China. And then Jared Kushner just Googled and looked for a book by some economist who didn't like China and found Peter Navarro that way. And so it really is downstream, I think, from Trump's existing ideological conceptions. Now, not all the tariffs, I think, can be explained that way. There is some pretty old school special interest politics involved too. For example, we have raised steel and aluminum tariffs. That's really a mainstay of American special interest politics. I think the U.S. Steel in particular, which is the main steel producer here, looms very large in the American imagination, right? As like the industrial behemoth from the 50s. It also is located in a swing state in Pennsylvania that's very important for the presidential map. And so, some of the tariffs I think have other explanations, but the overwhelming majority of them, what they call the reciprocal tariffs, those I think are just based on very old school mercantilist thinking. I don't think there's much more to it. One thing that people used to say is, and you'd hear this from, sort of pro-Trump Republican national security type, they'd say, no, we're laser focused on China. And during his first term, that was kind of a plausible interpretation of trade policy, because it really was true that tariffs with China, went up quite dramatically from around 8% or so when Trump came into office to maybe 20 by the time he left office the first time, while tariffs imposed on the rest of the world basically remained where they were, went up maybe from 2% to 3%, something like that. Now I don't think you can make that case anymore. Now that we're just imposing tariffs on everyone, it really just is Trump thinking that trade is bad. There's no sense in which we're trying to move production towards friendlier countries or whatever the national security advisors to cook up as justification for the tariff thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, I think, because if it was all national security, then of course it doesn't explain tariffs on people, on Canada or
on Canada, right, which is one of our closest allies, and now we've managed to completely disrupt that diplomatic relationship with really nonsense.
with trade. Yeah, what do you think the impact will be on American consumers? Because I think this is interesting. A lot of the media landscape has kind of discussed this in various different ways. Some people some commentators are saying things like, well, look, the economy's recovered, the markets have sort of settled, things are actually going to be absolutely fine. A lot of people are saying that's because of the 90-day pause. What do we think will happen now since this has come back into play? And do you think that American consumers will feel the pinch as a result of these new import taxes?
Yeah, I think there was, and I think we could already see the consequences. Many commentators here have gotten very obsessed with trying to frame any economic policy in terms of inflation, because we had such high rates of inflation in 2022, 2023. So many policy debates that I don't think economists would naturally try to squeeze into an inflation frame now go down that route. And that's happened a little bit with trade too, where, of course, mechanically, when you impose tariffs, the import prices go up, and as a result, some retail prices will go up as well. But I think it misses the point. It misses the point a little bit because, of course, first of all, there's also tax increases, right, that reduce aggregate demand and put downward pressure on prices that way. There's no reason not to think that those two forces could just offset each other, unless there are specific frictions in other sectors that make it so that prices do not adjust downward. Now, and that may be true. Of course, the Federal Reserve knows that, and as a result, they have not lowered interest rates this year as they had intended to. We still remain with a regime of very high interest rates, much higher than they've been over the past couple of decades. And that is, of course, in part the result of the tariff policies that have been imposed. And so it's not that strange that you don't see inflation escalating when the central bank is keeping policy tighter than otherwise would to prevent that from happening. In fact, what you see as a result is that economic growth has slowed down quite meaningfully. As I said, we grew 2.8% last year, and now we're headed for like 1.2% or so, which is really a pretty dramatic slowdown. It doesn't happen that often that you make policy decisions that are so detrimental to prosperity that you manage to cut economic growth by more than half, right? It's quite difficult. If you look at, we recently passed this major package of tax reforms and spending increases here, some spending cuts too, actually, shockingly. And there, the projections are that 10 years from now, the GDP will, the most optimistic estimates say will go up by 0.5 percentage point. The most negative estimates say will go down by 0.5 percentage point. But that's over 10 years. Whereas here, in 6 months, they've managed to reduce economic growth by over a percentage point. But that really shows you how big of an impact it is. And so I'd say, the impact on American households and businesses as well, quite negative, and you can already see it in the hard numbers, not just in consumer confidence.
And do you think there are specific industries that are being more hard hit as a result of some of the tariffs? I mean, obviously there are the protectionist angle for certain industries, but do you think that there are certain industries that in the next few years, sort of in the shorter term, are going to really feel the impact of these tariffs?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that's good to know is that about half of American imports are intermediate goods, right? So they're not final consumer goods. They're inputs that other businesses use in their production processes. And so many manufacturing companies, in fact, rely quite heavily on imports. Perhaps the paradigmatic example is the American auto industry, which is super heavily integrated across North America with Canada and Mexico. And so with the new tariffs, we have threatened to impose there. We've imposed there. Now, a bunch of products are exempt, but who knows what's going to happen there soon. That will be an example of an industry that could be dramatically disrupted by new tariffs. And this is true really across the board for any industry that involves advanced manufacturing. The industries that are not hurt as much, ironically, are of course services industries that are that don't rely on tradable goods as much. And so you can think of maybe leisure and hospitality to the extent that international tourism is not disrupted. You can think of education to the extent that foreign students are still allowed to come. You can think of the healthcare industry to the extent that we don't put tariffs on pharmaceuticals. Sort of the large service industry. Of course, the public sector is not that reliant on imports. Now, those are I think domestically produced services are probably the industries that are the least affected. Manufacturing is probably the industry that's most affected. And that's, of course, in some ways, the reverse of what you would expect based on the rhetoric. But that's what I think is going.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You're absolutely right, because that is the complete opposite of what the rhetoric is saying. A lot of people are saying, well, labor costs are obviously lower in other countries, so we can bring back a lot of that manufacturing here, more jobs for Americans, etc., etc. Even though, of course, as you've just very eloquently outlined, a lot of those manufactured goods in the production process are reliant on imports. So it's very interesting. I think it's important to challenge that narrative. Can we talk a bit about the different sections that Trump used and whether or not there will be legal challenges? I think with IEPA, of course, using emergency powers in order to implement some of those tariffs as well. Do you think that there is actual scope for a legal challenge or legal challenges? Because he hasn't, of course, referred to Congress, and these are huge tax increases. Is this legal? Is IEPA because he used IEPA, is it going to then have some legal challenges? What's the scope here?
Sure. So there's a number of statutes that American administrations have traditionally used to impose tariff without going through Congress, and some of those are very traditional, explicit trade statutes. There's one to impose safeguard measures when domestic industries are suddenly under stress. There are national security measures. There are ways to respond to unfair trade practices. You'll hear people throw around things like Section 201, Section 232, Section 301. Those are the traditional trade policy sections. The statute that Trump has almost exclusively relied on now in his second term, including for all of the Liberation Day tariffs, is the IEPA statute that you mentioned. It's an international economic emergency statute that is, according to the text of the statute, meant to deal with emergencies created by unusual and extraordinary threats. And it allows the president to then impose measures that, quote unquote, deal with the threat, including, a list of verbs, including regulating importation. And so that judicial basis for most of Trump's tariffs is what's under attack. And it's under attack in a range of ways, in multiple lawsuits. I'll highlight one of the lawsuits because it's the one that's the most advanced. It's VOS Selections. It's a wine importer versus Trump, a case that's now merged with the lawsuit that a number of democratically run states have started against the Trump administration. They won in the Court of International Trade, which is a court of first instance, and they are now before the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the appeals court that you have to go through before you go to the Supreme Court. The hearing there was in late July. The court heard a number of arguments, including regular, very textual arguments about the statute. For example, regulating importation is about, certain types of packaging. It's not about imposing tariffs. The word to regulate does not mean to tax, is one argument that was made. There's an argument that trade deficits, an argument that I think is correct, that in fact, that I myself made in an amicus brief that I organized with a bunch of economists in this case, which is that trade deficits are not an unusual and extraordinary threat. They're neither unusual and extraordinary nor a threat, in fact, and so it fails on two grounds. So that's an argument people make. There's an argument that I made as well, which is that the tariffs do not actually deal with the bilateral trade deficits that the administration has argued they would address, because my view, and I think the sort of orthodox view within the economics profession, is that the aggregate trade deficit is driven by macro decisions around consumption and saving, not by narrow details of trade policy. unless you go all the way to autarky. And if you accept that view, then of course, on the bilateral trade balance front, you're just, you may reduce one trade deficit, but that'll increase another. So there's no way in which these tariffs will actually address the quote unquote threat they are purportedly addressing. So those are statutory issues. Then there's a couple of constitutional issues too. Basically, one, can the Congress, which is responsible for tax policy and for tariff policy, delegate that authority to the executive branch to such an enormous extent? There's a so-called non-delegation doctrine in American constitutional law under which that is doubtful. And two, the consequences of these tariffs are enormous, right? Tons of revenue is going to collect, disruptions all over the economy, imports from all over the world are affected. And so this constitutes, my view is that this constitutes what the Supreme Court refers to as a major question. And then under its major questions doctrine, Congress has to very explicitly authorize the executive branch to take such actions, even if they are allowed to delegate them. Whereas here, of course, with the regulating implication language, they've only done so in the broadest of terms, and that's not sufficient under that doctrine. So those are the arguments. We'll see where it goes. I went to attend the oral argument. I'm reasonably optimistic plaintiffs may win, but we'll see.
So you are optimistic that there could be some success?
Yeah, I think it's more than a 0% chance. I think maybe. I'm not super confident. I'm not saying there's a 90% chance the appellate court will strike down the tariffs and affirm the district court's decision. But I think there's a good chance. I think there's certainly a much greater chance that the courts will strike down the tariff than that the executive branch will see the light, or that Congress will override Trump anytime soon. And so I think it's certainly our best hope to get rid of these tariffs is through the courts, not through those other routes. The 30, 40, 50, maybe 60% chance, which is quite a bit. And it would be, I think, quite remarkable if it turns out that what is really the president's signature economic policy was illegal all along. It would, of course, prospectively make it very difficult for him to continue his policies. But it would also retroactively mean that they would have to refund what by the time the Supreme Court decides may well be something like $200 billion in tariff revenue that's collected, that they would have to refund to maybe as many as hundreds of thousands of importers, right? It would really be a catastrophe, I think, for the administration, but well deserved.
Yeah, well, indeed. And I wonder if you could talk about the trade deficit, so the budget deficit angle. So a lot of people have been saying that, well, these tariffs are now going to pay for the huge budget deficit. And there have been some interesting economists. I think I saw one in an article in the Washington Post that said, there is absolutely no way that these tariffs, even if they do raise all of this money, that it actually will even make a dent in the huge national deficit. So could you talk a bit about that argument and what you think is the actual reality of the situation?
Sure. So the U.S. now runs deficits year-over-year that are about 7% of GDP, which of course is quite enormous by the standards of other advanced economies. That it's particularly large when you consider that the U.S. federal budget is only around 20% of GDP, right? So if you look at our budget, about a third of it is deficit.
Wow.
And so that's a very large deficit. And I think people are rightly concerned about that. Our fiscal outlook is extremely, extremely bad. That said, the tariff revenue, I would say it makes a dent in it, because it is going to be around 1% of GDP. I think if the current high rates remain in place, maybe a little less than that. But so we would reduce the deficit from 7 to say 6.1 or 6.2 or 6.3%. Of course, it slows down economic growth too, so that offsets a lot of that.
Yeah,
that impact. But I think it's fair to say it would make a dent. But of course, it doesn't address the issue in a meaningful way in the bigger picture, right? We'd still be running a very large budget deficit. But I think the revenue that we're collecting is quite meaningful. In fact, it's an indicator of the damage done by the tariffs, that we're collecting so much revenue from what is ultimately a very poorly designed way of raising tax revenue. It's very heavily focused on a small subset of our consumption base, and it's a tax also on a significant amount of intermediate inputs. So I think it's very poorly designed under the traditional tax policy principles. And that's not even accounting for all the damage that's been done for our diplomatic relations, to negative impact on investment. But it does bring in meaningful revenue. I
Yeah.
think that's fair enough.
What would you do if you could change all of this? I mean, how would you reduce the budget deficit, and how would you ensure that trade is genuinely freer? I mean, I remember talking about this with another American, and I was basically saying, a lot of these so-called free trade agreements that are being negotiated are no better than they were before Trump came in. I mean, especially when you look at the UK-US free trade agreement. I mean, I think it's an insult to call it a free trade agreement. It really wasn't comprehensive at all. So what do you think is the sort of solution here? And would you just slash government spending? How would you solve this problem?
Yeah, so I agree with you on the trade agreements. I think what we've seen so far, and of course we don't really have details, and it's unclear how meaningful these agreements are, especially ones with the EU and Japan, where I think there's very stark disagreement over the terms of the framework agreement. Basically, the agreements consist of, we now have a high tariff on exports from the trading partner to the U.S., and then some marginal changes around the edges. Yeah. I wouldn't call them free trade agreements either. Now on the budget deficit side, yes, I would cut spending in certain areas. What's important, I think, to keep in mind is that so much of federal spending in the U.S. just goes to old age pensions and to healthcare programs. So that's where the spending cuts have to take place. In the reconciliation bill that just passed, Congress made a little bit of progress in some of the areas where they cut spending. For example, Medicaid, which is our health insurance program for lower income families and for certain types of long-term care for the elderly. They made some cuts there. I would probably design the cuts differently, but there are definitely cuts to be done there. Medicare, which is the regular health insurance program for the elderly in the U.S., is the area, I think, where you can make the most progress on the spending side. I think there are a lot of overpayments. There are a lot of providers who could be paid less. I think that's really an area that's ripe for cuts. It's politically quite difficult, but it's an area that's ripe for cuts. Of course, in Medicare, you could also try to move some responsibility for insurance away from the federal government to seniors, especially higher income and wealthier seniors. The same goes in Social Security pensions, where we pay the highest public pensions to the seniors who need them the least, right? You get a higher Social Security benefit if you had higher incomes during your working life. But lots of Americans, certainly higher income ones, also have significant private pension savings and really don't need a major top up. And so you could try to make that pension benefit flatter, right? Don't pay high income seniors much more than lower income seniors and make it more of a flat benefit. I think that's where the spending cuts have to come.
What would the politics of that look like? Because I mean,
it's disaster. That's why it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
No, for sure. No, I'm talking now. Without taking the politics into account.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's
the reason why they end up doing stuff like, now we're cutting most of the spending cuts the administration is doing. It's stuff like foreign aid, is kind of marginal, and it's not clear that it's that it passes any kind of reasonable cost benefit test. But we're doing that because that's politically palatable. And honestly, I think it's what drives a lot of the tariff stuff too, because the American politicians are so hesitant to raise any other tax, even on the left. So during the most recent campaign, Trump and Kamala Harris both agreed that so they had some disagreement on taxing the very highest income households, but they both agree that households earning less than $400,000 a year in household income should not see tax increases of any kind. Right, so that excludes the overwhelming majority of taxpayers of tax. And so instead, we're now doing this cute game where we pretend that tariff tax revenue comes from free and is paid for by foreigners, which of course is just not the case. 90% of the incidence or so is on American consumers and firms. But yeah, both on the spending and on the revenue side, the politics of the budget here are very complicated, and there ultimately are just very few voters who genuinely care about about fiscal conservatism, about fiscal sustainability. And so it's difficult to see what's going to happen there. On the more wonky side on the left, you have some people who support a value-added tax or carbon tax, those kinds of things, which could be major revenue generators, but that seems politically very difficult to. So, for now, we're just going to have 7% deficits, I think.
Well, indeed, the politics of it, I think, is really interesting, especially with regard to, there's so many comparisons here with the UK. Old age pensions and health spending in the UK is absolutely rampant. And there is no way that we'll be able to look towards the future in a sustainable way without significantly reducing that. But it seems as though what has happened with cutting spending with regard to Doge has basically just been reducing headcount and not actually rethinking the role of the state. What should the state actually do? Where should the state be involved? And of course, conversations about reducing spending where it's going on individuals that perhaps don't necessarily need it. Before we move on to immigration, just very quickly, I wondered if you could touch on what the politics of all of these trade conversations are actually looking like. Obviously, you're based in Washington, D.C., so thinking about what is the mood? Do people feel as though there will be successful legal challenges to these new tariffs? And do you think that there is an appetite for further protectionism, or is there more of an appetite now for free trade?
Those are good questions. I think there is some optimism around the lawsuits, though, of course, right, as I mentioned, the administration would have some other legal instruments to impose tariffs. They wouldn't be as widespread or as long-lasting as the ones they impose now. So it at least improves the regime. The politics of trade are quite interesting now. I think there's still a narrow center that is very pro-free trade. On the right, you also still have some committed libertarians, very small in number in the Congress, but there's 2 or 3 of them. Senator Rand Paul is probably the highest profile. One of Senator from Kentucky. And so those are the very principled, those are the more principled free traders. Then, of course, now the bulk of people on the right are, quite committed to protectionism now because of their fealty to Trump. And of course, on the left, you have the traditional left-wing, union-oriented protectionists who are not very comfortable criticizing Trump's policies. The line you'll hear from those people, even quite a few people on the center left, is no, of course, tariffs can be good. They have to be targeted. There's always lots of caveats before criticizing what, of course, has been an extremely disruptive, completely different regime of protectionist measures. And so that also makes me think that it really has to come from the courts, at least in the short run, because I just don't see how you can cobble together a majority in both the House and the Senate to overturn some of these decisions. In the Senate, you may be able to get to 50, maybe. In the House, Republicans are just not going to let any anti-Trump tariff measure come to the floor. So those are the politics. I think a lot of Democrats are probably getting negatively polarized against tariff because Trump has been so insistent on them, and so that will probably change the politics on the center left quite a bit. On the right, maybe if Trump is gone, we'll revert back to more of a free trade mindset. But I'm not extremely optimistic. Certainly not for the coming 3 years.
Well, indeed, and that's why the work that you do is so important. Let's move on to immigration. So you co-wrote a paper last month entitled Immigration Policy and its Macroeconomic Effect in the Second Trump Administration. Could you tell me a bit about what is happening with regard to immigration in the US this year? It has been widely distributed on social media, and a lot of people in the UK are saying we need some of that. So could you tell me a bit about what's actually been going on with regard to migration and what the macroeconomic effects have been?
I think what's been most salient so far have been the deportations from the interior. U.S. has a very large illegal immigrant population, well over 10 million people. What's I think important to keep in mind is that most of that population has been here for quite some time. I would say probably more than half has been here for over 15 years at least. And so it's lots of people who've been here for extended periods of time. Many of them have children who are U.S. citizens, because in the U.S., of course, you become a citizen if you're born on American soil. And many of them have American citizens, spouses, or other relatives. And so that I think is important context. That population, very unpopular to remove more than a minimal percentage of it. I think you see, and we've seen immediate public opinion backlash against the deportations. The numbers on immigration are now the opinion polls on immigration now are as pro-immigration as they've ever been, even though they were quite negative just a year ago when Trump or just 8 months ago when Trump got elected. And so I think that's on the deportation side. Now, from a macro perspective, the deportation efforts, I don't think actually have been that important yet. The pace of deportations is not much higher than it was last year. There have been a lot of arrests, but so far I think they've mostly let the more people in immigration detention than actual deportations. But even if all the additional people who have been arrested were deported, I still that would still not be as important for overall net migration as the changes to inflows have been, because that's where the real changes have been so far. So the past few years, millions of people came to the U.S. Through the southern border. Not so much from Mexico, mostly from Venezuela and a number of Central American countries. That flow has really come to a halt. It started slowing down last summer during the Biden administration. There were new restrictions on asylum applications. The U.S. Also has worked with Mexico to have Mexico keep people from coming in. And so that flow has really dried up. So that's a big drop in inflows that are, some people think of this as illegal immigration, though most of the people come, of course, apply for asylum. And so they just come to the border, apply for asylum, and they follow the legal process. That's now very difficult to just come. You basically can no longer come to the border and apply for asylum. So that's why that flow has come down. We'll see how long it lasts. There have been these pauses in immigration before when policy strictness ramped up, and then a few months later you'd see people coming in anyway, just because the push factors are so strong. One thing that probably helps quite a bit in reducing those flows is the fact that the labor market in the U.S. has weakened quite a bit under the Trump administration, and really since 2022 or so. And so that you often see in the U.S. that those flows respond quite strongly to.
In what way has the labor market weakened?
Sorry.
In what way has the labor market weakened?
Just in the sense that there are fewer vacancies per unemployed person. Like this in that time, and you see it in the broader macro slowdown. Anyway, so those numbers have come down a lot. Then, in addition, the administration has made pretty meaningful cuts to legal immigration too. So there were a number of programs that the Biden administration set up. The biggest one was the humanitarian parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, or Venezuelans who could come to the U.S. if they had an American sponsor, and then live and work illegally. There's a number of other similar programs. There's also the refugee resettlement program, which most Western countries participate in, and that runs through the UN. All those legal pathways in fiscal 2024 brought in about 500,000 people, and they're all gone. And so that's a big cut too. And so those cuts on the inflow side, so both on the southwestern border and through a number of these other legal programs, that's what's really made the difference so far. And so this year, in our report, we project that we're going to see net migration of around 0, which is a dramatic drop from last year when we were, maybe above 2 million. And in a normal year, the U.S. is at around 1 million. So for normal, if you look back past 20 years or so. And so this year, we may even see, negative migration, which really would be something that hasn't happened for about 50 years or so. But to summarize, so what I would emphasize, it's really the inflow of income. The impact will be the slower GDP growth. I think some of the slowdown we've seen that we talked about earlier, from 2.8% to maybe a little bit above 1% growth this year, some of that's driven by immigration. So in our report, we think maybe 0.3, 0.4% is. So that's a meaningful macro impact. It will show up even more clearly in job creation, which is a number that people in markets are always very focused on because it's seen as very important for monetary policy decisions. There, I think for the rest of this year, we may see job growth that's quite close to 0. And of course, that's going to make Trump really mad. We already saw last week he fired the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If the numbers are going to be this, man, I don't know what they're going to do. but they're going to be much lower than they were in prior years, just because so much of the growth of the labor force in the U.S. in recent years has come from immigration. With immigration, net immigration effectively at zero, job growth is going to be quite minimal, I think. Those are the macro impacts. Of course, the micro level, is going to be specific businesses, specific households that are going to be worked much harder, right? If you, it's easiest to picture, of course, on the deportation side, 0.3%, a 0.3 percentage point slowdown in GDP growth doesn't sound like that much. But if you lose one of two parents in a household, right, that's a massive negative shock to household income that is, really impossible to overcome by working more, by earning more, or whatever. And so it's going to be individual households. It's going to be businesses who lose employees, or who are counting on employees coming in, or who are based in neighborhoods that saw rapid population growth from immigration over the past 2 years. If you are a business in Miami and you thought, well, we've seen this rapid population growth, I am going to plan to open an additional restaurant or two, and suddenly the inflow stop, or people even leave because the Trump administration pulls their work authorization. That's going to have very detrimental effect. And so it's going to be while the macro impact may not sound that large, it's going to have a very asymmetric impact on specific households, businesses, industries, and parts of the country.
Could you emphasize exactly why net zero immigration is not something that any country should be striving for, especially a country that's so reliant on that kind of immigration inflows? Why is net zero immigration not something that we should be seeking to emulate?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of reasons. So at the macro level, maybe the most important reason is simply that we have a massive federal debt that's overhanging. The more people come in, the less of a burden that is for each individual. Then secondly, and this is a little more of a medium to long-term consideration, a lot of innovation, entrepreneurship in the U.S. has traditionally been driven by relatively recent immigrants or their children. And so you're going to lose a lot of that. And of course, without innovation, without new successful companies, our economic growth is going to slow down above and beyond just the compositional effect of having fewer people here. So I'd point to those two things as big macro factors. More on a geopolitical level, of course, the bigger a country is, the easier it is to defend yourself, to provide military support to your allies. One thing I think we're seeing with China is not that wealthy. It's kind of a middle income / poor country, and it's extremely powerful just because it has so many people. Now, we can try to emulate that at least to some extent. So there's two macro reasons, one national security reason. And then, of course, at the micro level, of course, people benefit tremendously from being able to marry, work with, do business with, go to school with, whoever they choose to. And, a lot of those potential ties are getting disrupted by these disruptions in immigration.
Stan, this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think it's been really, really interesting. I think that just to finish off, obviously immigration and trade have both had a huge impact on the economy as a whole, and it will do over the next few years. Obviously, economists shouldn't always be in the business of predictions, but what do you sort of what do you think is actually going to be happening over the next few years? And do you think there will be some pushback against this kind of quite, big state intervention in the economy?
I do think so. I think on the immigration side of things, you're already seeing opinion polls just flipping completely, and I imagine that we'll see that permeate policy as well. The moment Democrats regain some control at the federal level, you're already seeing, of course, quite a bit of pushback against Trump's policies at the state and local level, where Democrats are in control in many places. On trade policy, I'm a little less optimistic, just because of the fact that both parties are born over on the topic, and the pro-free trade side is not necessarily an overwhelming majority in either party. But I do think Trump has been so extreme in that area that you'll see some pushback, some rollbacks from Democrats when they come into office. I'm not sure we'll go back to the status quo, unfortunately, what we saw in the first Biden administration effect was that we basically kept all of Trump's policies in place. I'm hopeful the next Democrat will not make that mistake, but we'll see. My hope, as I mentioned, is really lies with the courts in that area, at least in the next 3-4 days.
Stan, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation and really great for us to gain some insights into what's happening across the pond. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you are interested in learning more about the IEA's work, then do subscribe to our Substack, insider.iea.org.uk.